Welcome to Reckoning with Real Estate. I'm Paige Kao with the Real Estate Collaborative, and I'm joined in studio today by my colleague, Megan Howard.
Hello.
Hey, Megan. She's
Hi,
also with the Real Estate Collaborative. And our special guest today is Ed Goetz, Professor Ed Goetz to me. He was my professor way, way, way back at the Humphrey Institute. So welcome, Ed.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. I'm going to read your bio and then we'll get started.
Okay.
I'm going to read it exactly as it's written, just so you know.
Yeah.
So Edward G. Goetz. What does the G stand for?
Glenn.
Oh.
And have you worked out the initials?
Egg. I just did.
Nice.
It's been a lifelong burden.
Okay. So Edward G. Goetz specializes in housing and local community development planning and policy. His research focuses on issues of race and poverty and how they affect housing planning and implementation. His most recent book, The One-Way Street of Integration, Fair Housing and the Pursuit of Racial Justice in American Cities, 2018 Cornell University Press, examines the tension between the pursuit of integration and community development efforts that focus on building power in communities where people are. Goetz is a professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He has served on a variety of local and national advisory committees related to affordable housing and community development. He is a past winner of the University of Minnesota's Distinguished Teaching Award for Outstanding Contributions to Post-Baccalaureate, Graduate, and Professional Education. And I can attest you were like, I mean, it was between you and John Adams, I'll be honest. You guys kind of tied for first, depending on the day. You might have been second.
I'll take it.
Yeah, you were in very, very good company.
Yep.
Yeah. So the Real Estate Collaborative, we're a real estate company and we also do housing justice work, which is kind of why you're here with us today. And I'm so thankful that you agreed to spend your time with us.
Glad to do it. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. And so we're going to do a couple episodes with you.
Okay.
And this is the first one. And it's a provocative title, what we're going to talk about. And it's based on a paper that you wrote with were these students that you wrote this with, or?
Yes, both of those co-authors received their PhD in urban planning at the Humphrey School.
Okay, and I'll just read their names. Rashad A. Williams and Anthony
Damiano.
So it's a paper that was written by the three of them, and it's called Whiteness and Urban Planning. And it's a different take on kind of how we usually talk about neighborhood segregation. Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, the Twin Cities, like Minneapolis and St. Paul, is generally ranked within the top 4 or 5 most segregated metropolitan areas in the country. Is that true?
And that has changed over time. The degree of segregation has declined significantly, even over the years in my career. So I think right now it's in what is called the moderate range.
Okay.
And there would be a number of metropolitan areas with higher degrees of segregation than you see in the Twin Cities.
Okay, well that's good to know.
Has that changed because of what's occurred in other cities, or has the Twin Cities made modifications too?
That's a good question.
Segregation has declined in virtually all cities over the past 30 or 40 years. Declines at different rates, and in some places it's gone from extremely high down to high. So the fact that it's improving doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a good situation, or that we've reached the point where we want to be. Mm-hmm. I think that it has to do with the suburbanization of people of color in the Twin Cities at a rate that might have exceeded that which has taken place in other metro areas.
So I'm going to back up a little bit. I do want to get to your paper, Whiteness and Urban Planning, which I find pretty fascinating. It was written in 2020. So we'll come to that in a minute. But why don't we talk about first, since we're talking about neighborhood segregation, what in your mind were the major drivers of neighborhood segregation? Like, why do we see these patterns of segregation in our urban areas?
Sure. I think I like to think of it, and when I teach of it, I think of it in three ways. First of all, there was a good deal of blame that needs to be accorded to the public sector. So for much of the 20th century, public policy created and reinforced patterns of racial segregation in metropolitan areas. You had redlining, which was sort of a process of identifying which neighborhoods were worthy of public sector investment and private sector investment. This was a practice pioneered in the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency.
Oh, I had forgotten that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also had, even earlier than that, local governments, mainly in the South and border states, that actually adopted literal racial zoning ordinances, which identified districts and the types of people who could live in those districts versus other districts. These racial zoning ordinances were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917, but they persisted for another 30 years.
So is that distinct from the racially restrictive covenants? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
And so racially restrictive covenants are, of course, deed restrictions that apply to individual parcels, individual properties. And in the 1930s, the federal government recommended their use widely, and they were adopted. The federal government didn't invent the idea, but the federal government gave it license, basically, on a national level, and said that this is a very effective way of maintaining the racial integrity of a neighborhood. And this was policy for 15 to 20 years. Racially restrictive deeds were outlawed by another Supreme Court decision in the late 1940s. But they too were pursued and for years and years after that. So you had all these actions by federal and local governments that were aimed at creating racial segregation and maintaining it. So you had that. You also had rampant discrimination in the private housing market. So for most of the 20th century, the housing markets in metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas across the U.S. were rife with discrimination. And so, which included things like steering some families to some neighborhoods, white families to white neighborhoods, and non-white families to non-white neighborhoods. You had other forms of discrimination that discouraged or made it extremely difficult to cross color lines. So you had so that's the second kind of leg of this three-legged stool. And the third leg is the United States, unfortunately, has a horrific history of grassroots racism and violence and intimidation that worked hand in hand with government policy and private sector discrimination to create and maintain color lines in metropolitan areas across the United States. So by violence and intimidation, I'm talking about mob actions. Mobs of white residents would show up at the house of a black family who dared to buy into a white neighborhood. Their actions were often accompanied by violence, and so there was that activity. There was the activity of neighborhood organizations that would actively fight against integration. So these are the forces that were in play, as I said, in government, in the private sector, and in the community sector for most of the 20th century, which produced some of the most racially segregated cities in the entire world.
Yeah. Well, and one of the reasons that we decided to start the Real Estate Collaborative, and you were kind enough, maybe this wasn't intentional, but you were kind enough to leave realtors out of your description of why neighborhoods are racially segregated. But
it was an oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. As you know, realtors were very engaged in steering, in drafting the racially restrictive covenants that developers could then use. But we just got tired of hearing our industry issue very tepid apologies and then do nothing else, go no further, which I am sad to say. So we're going to be 3 years old here in April, the Real Estate Collaborative. And we've been working very actively with our associations to get something to change, and nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. They push back, they fight back. So what was there was one other point I was going to make, and now I forget it because that's what happens.
Right when you started Rec Page, the Real Estate Collaborative, a reason that I knew I wanted to join was because we put it out there right now as a brokerage. We understand that there is most certainly a housing crisis, and it is due to historical injustices that have segregated the Twin Cities. And just to be able to say that, I know I'm an agent with Pages the broker. I was always embarrassed to tell people that I had my real estate license, but to be able to say that I'm with a brokerage that is, walking the walk, I'm just very grateful for Paige to have the brokerage. And as you were talking about the different covenants and the neighbors showing up, one of the other cool things that came out of just right when we were starting Rec was the History Museum was just putting on their production of Not in My Neighborhood. I don't know if you saw that. It's really good. And they just did another one. So I don't know if any of the listeners caught that. They just did the History Museum or Landmark Theater put it on this winter or fall. And it was another way of showing that it was not long ago in our history,
right.
in Highland Park,
in
St. Paul,
neighborhoods,
that white neighbors gathered to try and drive out.
Right.
And that reminds me of the other thing that I was going to mention, which I will mention on the other side of the break, because we are now going to break and we will be back in a couple minutes and continue our conversation with Professor Ed Goetz, or otherwise known as Egg. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Into the night, oh what a sight! Wrecking balls in flight, bringing down the light. Every swing it.
Welcome back to Reckoning with Real Estate. Paige, Kale, and Megan Howard with the Real Estate Collaborative, joined still by Ed Goetz, Professor Ed Goetz with the Center of Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and we're talking about neighborhood segregation. Megan mentioned before the break the play Not in My Neighborhood, which talks about just kind of personal, like people not wanting people of color in their neighborhood and actively fighting to keep them out back in the 50s, 60s in St. Paul. That's what that play is about. And I also wanted to mention Jim Crow of the North, the PBS special that really, I think, does a fantastic job of, Minnesota's very far north. We didn't have the Jim Crow laws, but these segregating and, saying people can live here, but people of color have to live over here. This was our Jim Crow of the North. This is how we managed to keep populations separate from one another based on the color of skin. And the second half of this episode, we're going to talk about Ed's paper. It's called Whiteness and Urban Planning. We're going to have a link to it in the notes. This was a paper that was done in 2020. And it was done with Rashad A. Williams and Anthony Damiano. And you must have been working on this well before George Floyd.
Yes, and it was published 3 months before George Floyd's murder.
Wow.
So why don't you tell our listeners kind of the premise of the paper, Whiteness and Urban Planning? It's a provocative take.
Yeah, so this came in part from the fact that I'd been teaching about housing and housing policy for 30 years. And I used to teach, maybe you'll recall some of this, Paige. I used to teach about the public housing program and how it was well-intentioned. This was to provide folks with housing who absolutely needed it. And it failed in part because it began to become associated with race and was disinvested in, and it was a tragic mistake and failure.
So I do remember this. I remember it very well. And what was, when it started, when the public housing system started, what was it intended to be? Like what was the...
It was intended to be a way station for the temporarily poor who were made that way by the Depression. So this is a program that was started in 1939 and reestablished in 1949. And so it was meant for those who were temporarily out of work to get back onto their feet.
And it was race neutral.
And it was race neutral. And in fact, for its probably first 15, 20 years, it was mainly provided housing to white families. Coming out of the Depression and then out of World War II, you suddenly have a huge expansion of the private sector housing market, all of this suburbanization, new homes being built. But given the discrimination in the housing market that we talked about, that housing was primarily made available to white families. So white families could move out of public housing because they had options. Black families who were being discriminated against in the housing market didn't have those options. And so for many Black families, public housing was the best option that they had. And we continued to build new public housing over time. And this became then one of the reasons why public housing became identified with people of color. And when that happened, then it started to experience disinvestment, and cities and the federal government simply didn't keep it up over time. So anyway, there's that. And then I used to teach about the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and how that helped to resuscitate home ownership in the United States and the private market. And that was a great success, except for the fact that it had negative racial outcomes because people of color were largely excluded from that market. And I used to teach about regional housing policy and how that works, except for the fact that race was a problem and racial discrimination and prejudice interfered with the goals. So there was a moment when I realized that I had been teaching for 25 years that this program works except for race. This program works except for race. That program works except for race. And there's a point at which you wonder, maybe these aren't isolated failures of a system, but that this is the system, that this is a well-functioning system. And it's a system of racial subordination. It's a system of racial domination. It's a system of white supremacy, and that it works in these various ways. And by putting the spotlight on whiteness and the preservation of white advantage, and instead of looking at the problems that people of color face and the problems that they experience, when you shift the focus away from the so-called problems of people of color to the advantages and privileges of whites, you see a lot of things become clearer that weren't clear before.
Mm-hmm. You said in the paper, whiteness simply cannot exist without its fabricated other, and also that segregation of affluence is greater than the segregation of poverty. And I think after reading through what you wrote, it is it's an important way of flipping in your mind how you see different neighborhoods, especially here in Minnesota, I think, and trying to figure out how do we take what we see in white areas that is good, like a good rec center, a good playground, and put it into all neighborhoods of our cities. Do you see that as, what would that take? Are we talking just money? And
yeah, well, and that's one of the things we were trying to achieve with this paper, because I do think it takes, in addition to money, it takes a different mindset.
Right.
It takes a different perspective.
Yep.
You mentioned that you pulled from the article the fact that wealth is more segregated than poverty. And the most segregated racial group in the United States are whites, right? So
can you explain what you mean by that for our listeners?
Sure. So most people, when you talk about racial segregation, the image that pops into your mind is the Black ghetto or the Latino barrio, right? And so our association with segregation is clusters of non-white people, right? But in fact, the group that lives with themselves the most, right? The group that clusters the most in residential areas across the United States are white people. So you are much, now, a lot of that has to do is because most of the population is white. And so there's a greater opportunity. But in fact, whites are separated from all other races at rates that exceed the degree to which other races are excluded from, are isolated. So there's that, and there's another thing that that we talk about in the paper. Another example of flipping the script and the perspective is we talk about this phenomenon of property values that don't appreciate as quickly in diverse neighborhoods as they do in white neighborhoods. And one analyst called that the segregation tax. So the idea being that people who live in diverse or predominantly communities of color, they pay a kind of a tax in the sense that their property doesn't appreciate it more. Well, in the paper, we say, well, what if we thought about that as not a segregation tax paid by people of color, but a segregation dividend that is experienced by white people? And what does that do? You know, it's a Paige, you studied at the Humphrey School. You know what we talk about when the way you define a problem determines the solution set. And so if we're defining this problem in one way, there's a whole, there's an associated set of solutions. The power of reimagining the problem and creating it and looking at it from a different perspective is that it does provide the potential for additional set of solutions.
I think that's a very powerful way to think about it, and that's my phone and oopsies. We're gonna just turn that off. So thinking about the segregation dividend as opposed to the segregation tax, and of course now we're running out of time. Goes by very quickly. And we're going to continue the conversation in the next episode because I think we have to get, we have more to talk about. One of the things that, a quote that I always love is, if you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem, which I think kind of gets to this a little bit. So, Ed, thank you again. Professor Goetz. I don't know Ed.
Ed's fine.
Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next time. And Megan, thank you as well. And you're listening to Reckoning with Real Estate with the Real Estate Collaborative, and we hope you come back next Sunday. Take care.
Still show every move